This is the Kamasutra. It's widely known as the Indian book of acrobatic sex positions. When both the legs of the woman are contracted and placed on her stomach, it is called the crab's position. And since its original composition around 2,000 years ago, it's been translated, pirated, and illustrated. It's inspired chocolates, branded condoms, films, and yes, even furniture designed for Kamasutra moves. But the part about sex positions is only a fraction of the book. It doesn't even have any pictures. And the rest? A girl who is called by the name of a tree or of a river is considered worthless, as also a girl whose name ends in R or L. Turns out, the Kamasutra is very misunderstood.
It is telling that of all the Sanskrit texts that this country has produced, and we have produced God knows how many thousands, the Kamasutra is the one text that has been heard of across the world.
The Kamasutra, which roughly translates to Treatise on Desire, was originally compiled in ancient Indian language Sanskrit by philosopher Vatsyayana sometime around the 3rd century. It found popularity in the West centuries later. British explorer Richard Francis Burton, an orientalist famous for his travels east in the 1800s and for translating the Arabian Nights into English, commissioned the first English edition of the Kamasutra. Burton's goal was to introduce it to a sexually repressed Victorian society at the time. And in order to avoid Britain's obscenity laws, he created a club to privately publish erotica from the East that would otherwise be illegal to print, including the Kamasutra. It wasn't until nearly 100 years later, during the era of the sexual revolution, that the US legally allowed the publication of the book. And once it hit the internet in the 1990s, often only the sexy chapters were copied and circulated, which created the image of the Kamasutra most people know today.
People were actually looking to this text for a kind of, perhaps an oriental version, an exotic version of sex that India could provide, without understanding the larger cultural context.
So, if the book isn't a sex manual, what is it? It's more of a manual for living a life of leisure and luxury in India during this time period. The parts about sexual activity make up one section out of 7. Outside of the chapters like kissing, biting, and different ways of lying down, the book details how a man should set up his home. Not far from the couch and on the ground, there should be a round seat, a toy cart, and a board for playing with dice. Outside the outer room, there should be cages of birds. It also covers the 64 arts every public woman of high quality should master, including tattooing, playing on musical glasses filled with water, cooking, the art of teaching parrots and starlings to speak, and knowledge of the art of war. And it explains how a man can acquire a wife, how best to commit adultery, and also some magic recipes. If a man throws this mixture on a woman, she will not love anybody else afterwards. At times, the book shifts to speak directly to women. There's a section on how one wife can maintain control in a household with multiple wives, and another section on how to be a profitable courtesan or sex worker.
It also gives a woman ideas about ways to manage men. And in that sense, it's about power as much as it is about pleasure, how to get what you want, how to make a man do what you want.
Historian Wendy Doniger argues that for its time, the book makes some pretty progressive statements about the role of women and their access to pleasure.
It explicitly mentions that one of the reasons for the Kama Sutra is because the purpose of sex is not to have children, but to have fun. That's a revolutionary thing to say.
But at the same time, the book is loaded with contradictions. It's less about the practice of sexuality and more about the control of sexuality. For example, it features a list of classes of women who are not to be enjoyed. And rape is listed as an acceptable last resort form of acquiring a wife. Give the girl some intoxicating substance and enjoy her before she recovers. 2,000 years later, it's not surprising that the text doesn't hold up. It's a book of its time, a historical account of what elite life and pleasure may have looked like in ancient India.
I don't think early Indian texts, any of them, can be fit into these categories of feminist or patriarchal as easily as we perhaps make them sound today. The task that it undertakes, in a sense, is a very fundamental one for all human society, which is how do you reconcile basic instincts and the desire for pleasure, the pursuit of pleasure, with social order and social obligations too.
Over the years, the Kamasutra has made its way from Indian philosophers to Victorian explorers to today's magazine columnists. And it's taken on a life of its own. The sexy bits have endured, while the more complex parts about gender and power and class have been lost in translation.